generations, liberation movements organized themselves along a very clear line: color. And looking at the literal physical barriers built into the infrastructure of the 20th century, that approach made perfect sense. When armed forces enforce segregation at gunpoint, the divide between the people and the state becomes an undeniable physical weight. So the earliest and most vital liberation movements built their coalitions around those exact boundaries. Shared appearance became the rallying cry against a system that punished them for it. The powers holding the guns invented and enforced these labels, black, white, colored, as political classifications to define the parameters of reality. By adopting these labels to organize resistance, those early movements unknowingly accepted the boundaries drawn by their captors. They were fighting the system, but playing entirely by its chosen rules. If you fight a structural ideology by focusing only on superficial biological markers, the actual machinery of control remains completely untouched. There is an ancient principle that gets to the core of this flaw. It is the spirit that quickens, the flesh profits nothing. Human behavior stems from mindset and worldview, regardless of biological appearance. This explains one of the most painful recurring themes in liberation histories: the individuals who looked like the oppressed, but actively worked against them. Power structures intentionally elevate individuals who mirror the oppressed visually, yet operate according to the values of the dominant system. We assumed that someone would act in our collective interest simply because they looked like us. True alignment is purely ideological. Organizing around appearance creates a blind spot wide enough to drive a Trojan horse through. Today, the rigid, highly visible racial lines of the 20th century have largely dissolved into a complex global system. Through liberal democracy, globalized capitalism, and media, a specific Western ideological framework has permeated global societies. Shared ways of thinking have replaced physical borders. The adversary is any person or institution that actively benefits from and upholds these systems of control. Because the system now operates on ideas, the people managing its levers can belong to any culture or nationality on Earth. Redefining the oppressor forces us to throw out the old maps of resistance. We are engaged in a global war of ideas. Global progress is currently measured by production, GDP, industrial output, and technological growth. This scale determines which nations are considered first world. But human civilizations require different metrics to sustain themselves: healthy ecosystems, family continuity, social cohesion, and demographic vitality. Societies structured around relentless economic competition and individual accumulation eventually crack. The pursuit of profit drains the resources necessary to maintain strong communities and secure environments. When measured by the health of their families and the stability of their populations, the nations leading the world in wealth are also leading it in structural decline. What much of the world has been conditioned to idolize as progress is actually an engineered trajectory towards systemic collapse. If a system erodes the foundations of human life, we have to ask who actually benefits from its continued existence. Europeans were the supposed winners. Yet data shows the masses of European citizens were lured into an engine that consumed their labor, fractured their communities, and devastated their populations. White supremacy is an engineered ideological illusion, the Great White Lie. Racism functions as a strategic tool, a class system dividing the global majority so a small elite extracts wealth without resistance. By inserting artificial tiers between base and top, the system paid ordinary people in status, blinding them to their subjugation. True liberation demands the clarity to unplug from the machine entirely, rejecting the artificial definitions of success we were tricked into fighting for. The 20th century saw monumental political victories. Decolonization and civil rights movements dismantled explicit empires, yet yielded to persistent, globalized inequality. The traditional frameworks of resistance, Marxism, Afrocentrism, and anti-colonialism, built their strategies on a misdiagnosis of the enemy. These movements mapped the struggle along rigid phenotypic lines. They defined the oppressor strictly by race and color, framing the battle as a conflict between skin tones. In the 1950s and 60s, this racial cartography made strategic sense. These multilingual apartheid-era signs prove that at the time, subjugation was legally codified and physically separated. However, by organizing along these lines, the resistance adopted the very categories constructed by the oppressors. The system itself established the parameters of the fight. Because these movements derive their identity from the oppressor's own racial codes, they targeted the visible tools of control, while the deeper logic of the system persisted. The clear geographic and racial lines of the previous century have become obsolete. Modern liberal democracy and global systemic integration have erased those explicit borders. A decentralized hegemony has replaced the old colonial administrators. This modern landscape is bound by globalized consumption, technological homogenization, and massive corporate frameworks. These forces function as the invisible chains of a new global architecture. They subjugate populations across the planet, regardless of nationality. Past systems colonized land and resources. The modern system colonizes the mind and imagination. Analyzing modern global subjugation requires moving past phenotypic cartography. The modern struggle takes place on a strictly ideological battlefield. Clinging to obsolete racial maps guarantees defeat. It leaves us fighting a ghost while the real systemic architecture expands undetected. Inherited liberation theory contains a fatal flaw, the assumption that individuals will naturally act in the interest of their own demographic group. This is the logic of the flesh, the belief that phenotypic appearance is a reliable indicator of political or moral alignment. A more rigorous axiom is required for modern power. It is the spirit that quickens. The flesh profits nothing. Spirit in this context refers to the ideological programming, the worldview, and the psychological operating system of an individual. Global systems survive by elevating individuals who match the oppressed population phenotypically, but who are running the ideological code of the elite. Historical movements often stalled because they expected co-opted leaders to act against their internal programming based on skin color. Analyzing power effectively requires an overhaul of our core definitions. We must identify the oppressor as any entity, institution, or individual who promotes and upholds the Western ideological system, regardless of their race. Organizing a resistance based on physical markers alone guarantees failure against a decentralized ideological threat. Decades of scholarship frame white supremacy as a system designed to enrich Caucasians at the expense of Black populations. However, current demographic data indicates a different outcome. This forces us to ask how we actually measure the success of a civilization. We are witnessing a phenomenon of metric inversion, where systems appear successful on the surface while simultaneously collapsing at the foundation. Judged by artificial Western metrics like GDP and industrial output, the West appears triumphant. But contrast these with vital metrics, the biological and sociological pillars of human continuity. This wealth, success, and progress matrix reveals a different story. Look specifically at the fertility and family structure pillars. Across Europe and North America, birth rates and social cohesion are in sharp decline, identifying a society hostile to human continuation. The evidence suggests the system is destroying its supposed primary beneficiaries. Western progress is a systemic illusion. The ultimate beneficiary are the human population, but the self-perpetuating architecture of the system itself. White supremacy was an engineered, operational illusion. This illusion served a historical utility. It drafted the European masses into building an extractive, anti-life global economy. This psychological bribe gave the European working class an artificial sense of superiority. In exchange, they surrendered their own vital metrics and value systems to the elite. Navigating the modern global structure requires new definitions. Racism is a systemic class division tool utilized by elites to fracture resistance. We must define white supremacy as the Great White Lie, a deceptive mechanism of global control. The oppressor is the anti-life ideology itself and the individuals who execute its code. Genuine liberation requires moving past the reactive, phenotypic fights of the past. This requires an ideological shift away from the Western operating system toward a unified life consciousness. Systemic freedom begins when we stop fighting the ghosts of the flesh and start rebuilding the vital metrics of human survival.